Hi, I'm Jacob Asch, and I'm the opinion editor for the Cavalier Daily. And I'm here with the Adam Kimelman and Mary Alice Kukoski, who are the president of College Republicans and University Democrats. Today we're going to be talking about the General Assembly and some of the bigger issues that have been covered so far this term, and what issues really are pertinent to the UVA community and their two organizations at large. So, yeah, welcome, guys. So, both of your statewide organizations, like Young Democrats and the Young Republicans, have participated in lobbying the General Assembly for specific legislation. Can you talk a little bit about like those policies you cared most about at the beginning of the term?
So we participated, University Democrats participated in Lobby Day with kind of our larger parent organization, Virginia Young Democrats, which encompasses young Dems from ages 13 to 36. That was on Martin Luther King Jr. Day this winter, and we brought a large delegation of young Dems from UVA, and we lobbied on behalf of 3 different salient issues. The first one was felony larceny. And there were 3 different bills on the table at the time. And actually, we got to see one pass, which was great. The felony larceny threshold has been raised to $500. Originally, we wanted it a little bit higher, around $1,000 to $1,500. But this was like the bipartisan compromise that came out of the General Assembly, which we are really happy about. It's great to see our lobbying efforts really pay off in the form of tangible legislation. We also lobbied on behalf of, sexual education, and inform that it's not abstinence-based, that it's medically accurate. In public schools, that bill actually did not pass, but it is something that I think we'll continue pushing for, along with Virginia Young Democrats in the future. And we also push for the last one. It'll come to me, but if you want to go ahead and talk on yours.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks for having us. The main, I guess, legislative lobbying push that we had was in conjunction, actually, with University Democrats and Student Council for ranked choice voting. And for those of you who might not know, ranked choice voting is essentially you'd be able to rank the candidates instead of just voting for one of the candidates. For example, where this would come into, we think, a lot of help is in districts like Virginia, the House delegates 94th, where there was actually a tie, but there were about, I believe, 1,200 people who voted for a Libertarian candidate. So instead of going to a coin flip or something like that, essentially those votes of any candidate, so not just specific to that, but any candidate who didn't get a majority outright, essentially the lowest candidate would then be eliminated, and their votes would be redistributed to their second choice. So we'd actually have a more democratic outcome than flipping a coin, for example. And that's something that we were actually really excited to see that get out of subcommittee. It then went to finance. Unfortunately, did not make it out of finance, but it did make it unanimously out of privileges and elections committee, which we think is a big step in the right direction. And we're looking forward to doing more stuff like that in the future. I know that we also had a lot of our members went and lobbied to Virginia 21. I didn't go on that, so unfortunately I won't know. I know College Republicans Federation of Virginia had a Young Republican joint lobby day as well. I unfortunately did not attend that, so I'm not sure specific what exactly they were lobbying for, but I'm sure just most generally conservative causes. But I know that the Virginia 21 and the CRFE 1 were both pretty successful from what I got back from it, and I know that we were pretty happy with obviously the fair vote one or the ranked choice voting didn't get exactly as far as we would have liked, but we were happy that it definitely is making some progress and got a lot of bipartisan support. So, yeah.
Going back to bipartisanship, since the Democrats made such large election gains, we were wondering, we were talking about bipartisanship and a lot of the things that people could get done together because the Republicans still retain the majority in the legislature. And one of the things that is occurring is regulatory reform between Speaker Cox and Governor Northam. And they want to reduce regulations by 25% in 3 years. And what do you think of that compromise? And do you think that that is a positive step for just other compromises in the future? And do you think that more compromises like this are likely, like that sort of thing? Like, what do you think of bipartisanship so far in the House of Delegates?
Okay. Yeah, I get started. So yeah, I was really happy when I saw that actually. I think that's actually based off something that's going on at federal level. Is that the 2-for-1 compromise? So like for every one new regulation added, you get rid of 2. I believe that was put in there. I could also be wrong about that, but yeah, no, I definitely thought that was good. We are in kind of this weird situation for this last legislative session, and then the upcoming one. The fact that the House and Senate are they're Republican controlled, but they're also very, very close. So you get 1 or 2 Republicans to change their minds on something, and it completely changes the dynamic. And then we still have a Democratic governor. So I do think that it is making it, I think, hard for legislation to get passed. I think the success rate for a bill in the General Assembly was something like 36%. So most of them are going to die, but at the same time, it does open up kind of room for, and a necessity almost, to compromise if you want to get something done. I think that regulatory reform was one of the ones that we were happy to see a compromise come about for. And I know there's some other issues we might not get into them a little bit, like Medicaid expansion, where there's also some stuff going on. But yeah, no, we were happy with that.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think Democrats are really excited to see all our electoral gains this fall and to the legislation that would come out of that. And I think with that comes a lot of bipartisanship. And I think we were able to see some progress on that in this session. But I think definitely looking towards with Medicaid expansion and the next legislative session that there would hopefully be more bipartisan support, especially in the interest of students and other groups that need protection. So I think there was some tangible progress.
It's great you both touched upon Medicaid expansion, because that's actually my next question. How do you think actually pursuing Medicaid expansion is a feasible goal for the Commonwealth? And do you think the current disagreement can be overcome, considering it's already a pretty serious compromise between Speaker Cox and Ralph Northam? And do you think, this will actually get passed, or is it stalled again?
It's my hope that it'll get passed. I think it's really hard to tell at this point. There's a lot of bipartisan work on making sure that it's going to be the best deal. There's already been some give and take with the work requirement. So I think that is important. It's not necessarily what Democrats might have wanted, but I think if we want Medicaid expansion passed, and I think this is probably a step in the right direction with bipartisan support and some give and take there. And I know us as University Democrats, we are planning to make calls to a lot of our delegates and just ask them to support this ahead of the special session on April 11th.
Yeah, so this is something that there have been some Republicans who have come and said, we might be interested in this. Me personally, and again, I can't speak for the organization as a whole because we have a lot of different ideologies, and maybe some people are in favor of expanding Medicaid. Me personally, I don't think it's a great idea. Not because I don't necessarily, think that we should have more people have some sort of health coverage. That's definitely not the case. It's because Medicaid itself has become a program that is much different than the one it was designed to be. It was initially designed to be more of a safety net type program for the most vulnerable in society who really, really needed it. And now it's kind of been expanded to the number one way in which people are covered in terms of, like, if you look at the gains made by Obamacare were not made by private insurance. They're made almost all entirely through Medicaid. And when you continue to kind of overblow a program and increase spending, which also would be very much start to strain our budget, even though the federal government does give a lot of money in the beginning, as the cost shifts more over towards states, that's going to be a huge strain and create a massive federal program. So I think that there are solutions we can work for, and I think that one of the reasons I think a lot of Republicans are looking at this is because they're looking forward to the next election cycle, and when you have it be so close in the House and the Senate. If Democrats pick up one more seat in each, which could happen, it also could definitely not happen in the next cycle. It's way too early to tell. But if that happens, they might not be able to have a work requirement or something like there and there. So I think that Republicans that might be the reason it's happening. But I don't think that it's a great idea from my standpoint. Whether or not it will happen, I can't exactly tell.
Adam, just to follow up a little bit on that, I was wondering, because this is Speaker Cox and Governor Northam have worked out this compromise with the work requirements that have kind of mirrored the expansion in other Republican states. Does that not shift your opinion really at all, or is it still? Do you think Medicaid expansion is not the best idea?
Yeah, no. So I think that that's better than expanding without the work requirements. For in my personal opinion, but I just don't think that we should be expanding a massive government program that I don't think is that effective for people actually getting health care. In terms of, like, one example of that is that people will have coverage, they'll be covered under Medicaid, but less and less doctors are taking Medicaid. So they have health coverage, but they don't have health care. Yeah, so that's pretty much one of the major concerns is that if we're overblowing a program, it's going to cost a lot of money that eventually our generation is going to have to pay off because they're not really finding a way in order to do it. And then yeah, that's my question.
Moving to Charlottesville a little bit, there's a lot of talk about what could be done to mitigate the violence of what happened August 11th and 12th, and a lot of bills were filed to try to stop this sort of thing from happening. A few of them being giving Charlottesville and Albemarle the ability to regulate guns, such as banning high-capacity magazines from being carried in public, and ban guns at rallies or events, with big crowds. This legislation failed, though it was recommended by some official reviews. Do you think this sort of legislation would be helpful, or do you think the bill was rightfully killed?
I think this type of legislation would absolutely be helpful. Our organization actually wrote letters to some of our representatives that were on the different subcommittees in support of this legislation. It's something that I think touched a lot of students' lives this summer, and seeing it and experiencing it firsthand. And I think it's a type of legislation that is very tangible, and it's small steps in gun reform that I think need to be made. I think it just shows the polarization on the issue of gun reform, that nothing was passed. There was really no legislation. I think there could be some bipartisanship, but it's just not present at the time. And I would really hope that in the future, especially in light of the different movements that are working on behalf of common sense gun reform. We had the walkout. There's a March for Our Lives coming up next Saturday. So I would just hope that legislators would move on the issue of gun reform. And I think this just shows the polarization on the issue.
Yeah, I think that nobody is disagreeing that gun violence is definitely a problem. I think that we all realize that it is a problem. I think that the main way is in how we're going to go about that problem. And I think that kind of the walkout, I was encouraged because there were definitely people in student council reaching out to both, University Democrats and college Republicans for bipartisan ideas. And in terms of letter writing, I wasn't at the letter writing, station, but there were, ideas from both Republicans and Democrats, and all across the political spectrum in terms of what to actually write to legislators. When the walkout itself actually occurred, if any conservatives were there, I was there, and then almost immediately they just started talking about gun control, which kind of very much polarized the event itself. And I know that's a little bit off topic for the question, so I guess I'll get back to it. But I think that, even though it is very frustrating when people immediately assume that Republicans aren't worried about gun violence because they just have a different way of approaching it. So while those bills, and I'm not sure exactly what the exact bills were, I think for events like that, something like a gun ban might be necessary, so I'd have to look into what exactly that bill was about. But bans on things like high-capacity magazines or assault rifles, I think that I would be against, because I think that there are definitely technical problems with what an assault rifle is, for example, or where exactly the high-capacity magazine thing should end. And I haven't really seen any studies that show that lower capacity guns, which can be reloaded pretty quickly, wouldn't make any difference. Although, again, I'm always open to talking about that. But I think that just because Republicans have a different way of dealing with gun control in terms of making schools safer, trying to put more security in schools, trying to make sure that they are more secure and things like that, it is very frustrating when all of a sudden it's just kind of assumed that we don't like children or we're in favor of killing people. That's not the case. We just have a different approach to this.
It's actually interesting you bring that up, because my next question is about the restrictions that were recently passed in Florida, which has a Republican governor, and that was a compromise bill that had things like raising the assault weapons buying age to 21, and also installing some wait periods, but it also allowed for the arming and training of some teachers to try to help school security. Do you think in the wake of gun violence, do you think that sort of bipartisan compromise is what's necessary? Or do you think that these sort of legislative goals that aren't really being pursued in Virginia shouldn't really be pursued?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I was actually pretty happy to see that come about, and I think that there's a lot of common ground on this area. It just sometimes, because of politics, doesn't really talked about a whole lot. In terms of raising the age to 21 for rifles, I haven't seen any evidence to show that. I don't think that this individual and what happened in Florida would have been prevented if he were 22. I think that, is a mentally unstable individual who should never have been able to have a gun in the first place. And that comes with reforming our background check system. There are currently bipartisan goals on that in Congress, because when at 38 out of the 50 states report less than 80% of all pertinent information to the background check system. So the system's only as good as the information that's in it. As for some of the other things in that, so banning bump stocks, I'd be for that. I know a lot of Republicans are for it as well. So I think that's definitely a step in the right direction. And then, yeah, the wait periods, I guess I'd also be for that. But I think that fixing the background check system, which I'm not sure if that was addressed in the Florida legislation, I think that would be a lot more effective, as well as things like mental health training. And that is for arming teachers. So I personally have problems with arming teachers. I think they're probably different than, what some other people have. But I think that my main problem with it is that, in an active shooter situation, I think that the police are going to shoot whoever has a gun first and ask questions later. So that's just a practical problem with arming teachers. I would rather see trained armed security guards who do this as their job and, who are ex-veterans, know how to handle these situations, and who are, either very clearly marked or somehow alerted to police who will be responding to an active shooter situation. I don't think armed teachers. I definitely understand the logic behind it. I just think the practical problem is that, I don't think that would be good in an active shooter situation.
Yeah, I think touching on that point first, I actually don't really understand the logic behind arming teachers. I don't think guns should have any place in schools. This is where children go to learn. It should be a safe place, and guns should have no part in that. I think that it's kind of ignoring the larger issue. I think we should be attacking it from its root with a background check system, mental health screening, and also just having better training for gun owners and possibly like a licensing system, like to get your driver's license, you have to go through how many hours of like behind the wheel and driving on your own. I just recently got my boater's license and had to attend an all-day class for that, but there's no training for gun ownership. And I think that's something that could easily be enacted, and I would hope there would be wide bipartisan support on that. I think as for the legislation coming out of Florida, I think it is good to see some bipartisan support, but I think there are some larger issues, and I think there needs to be more action taken. But it's a small step in the right direction.
In Virginia, Speaker Cox has decided to do a panel on not gun safety, on school safety, and not really, talk about the issue of guns. And while school safety is definitely important, do you think that's like the direction we should be going in, or should we address problems with guns and accessibility with guns a little bit more directly?
I think it's kind of naive to have a panel on like school safety and not address the issue of guns, because that's kind of the central thing surrounding school safety. Like, I think we've seen with all the mass shootings that guns were the issue, and I think it's, again, like I was saying, you're not really hitting the issue like right at its root. You're kind of dodging it by school safety measures. So I think in order to more effectively implement legislation and identify the issue, we need to include guns in the dialogue. And I would hope that Speaker Cox kind of changes the focus of that ad hoc committee, because I don't think it's going to be productive unless guns are included in the discussion.
Yeah, so I think that, like, in terms of school safety, every community is going to be different, every school is going to be different. So I don't know if we can just approach this in one way. So just a committee, I'm definitely think that, if guns should be part of the dialogue in some of these certain cases, then I think that that's definitely something that should be incorporated. But I don't think guns are necessarily part of the problem or part of the solution. For example, like, I don't think armed security guards would work in every school district, because there are certain considerations and things that need to be accounted for. But I think that, there definitely needs to be a conversation about school safety itself, and there are definitely actions that we can take without using guns in some of these cases to make our children safer. Yeah, so I definitely think that it kind of depends on the situation. And that even though, if there's a panel on school safety, if guns are a necessary part of that, I think they'll be brought into the conversation kind of naturally. We don't need to almost link the issues of school safety and guns if every, resolution to school safety is going to be somehow dealing with guns, because I don't think that's the case.
All right. This term, the House of Delegates passed Delegate Wilt's bill to require Virginia K-12 schools, colleges, and universities to obtain written permission from a student or parent to release a student's address, phone number, or email to a third-party group. This was passed after NextGen, the progressive grassroots organization, took a lot of students' information and sent them unsolicited messages encouraging them to go vote. but that bill was passed instead of Delegate Hurst's bill, which was removes cell phone numbers and email addresses from public directories. Do you think Wilt's bill, where you have to obtain permission, is a good step, or do you think we should be removing some more personal information from these directories?
Yeah, so I think that first of all, I'm very happy with both of these pieces of legislation from Delegate Wilt and Delegate Hurst. I think that the primary difference is that home addresses would not be dealt with in Delegate Hurst's bill, and they are dealt with in Delegate Wilt's bill. So I think that they're pretty similar pieces of legislation. I think that written consent from either a parent or if you're over 18 yourself is enough. But the primary goal here is to make sure that organizations, political or not political, conservative, liberal, whatever, can't mass FOIA these things and use them for a campaign. Because it was a Democratic organization this time. It could very easily be a Republican organization next time. So I'm happy that this is a win for student privacy.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think it is a win for student privacy, and I think regardless of the partisan nature of the organization, it's always important to protect students. While I'm happy they were sending messages to say go out and vote, I think if they were used for a different purpose, I would probably feel differently. So I think this bill is a step in the right direction in protecting students, and yeah, I think it was good.
All right. This year, UVA has again decided to increase tuition as two tuition control bills were not passed this session. One offered by Delegate Jason Miyares from a Republican from Virginia Beach, which would have required each public four-year college in the state to have the same tuition rate for all 4 years that the student was attending, and one from Delegate David Reed, from a Democrat from Loudoun, who would have capped tuition rate students paid for the first academic term of this year. Do you think these bills are really what the General Assembly should be focused on in terms of trying to control college costs? Or do you think we should be taking a different approach to making colleges in the Commonwealth a little bit more affordable?
Yeah, this is definitely something that I think Adam and I both were in tune to. We're part of the Legislative Advisory Board of Student Council, where we kind of work on higher education policies, and this was definitely one of them, making college more affordable and kind of capping tuition, because right now the Board of Visitors can raise it kind of at their will and without any input from students. I think another bill that was on our radar was one that ultimately died, I think in appropriations or in one of the committees, about and there should be a public comment period before the Board of Visitors raises it. And I think that is a really tangible step, that there should be student, there should be parent, there should be faculty input before the Board of Visitors decides to raise tuition. This year they decided to raise tuition like right in the middle of exam season. It was just like not a great situation if anyone was really passionate about the issue, especially like low income students and people that have planned out their 4 years having this one tuition in mind. I think it really put them at a disadvantage. I also think that potentially setting a cap that when you enter a 4-year university, that'll be the tuition rate that you pay for the next 4 years, so that it won't just be raised when at the Board of Visitors decision. I think it's important I know like when my family's planning for college, they planned to pay the in-state rate for all 4 years, but it's being raised, and it can also be raised depending on if you're admitted into comm school or into Baton. There's different tuition rates for each school in the university, so I think it is really important that we do have some sort of bipartisan support on reforming tuition.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. This was something the Legislative Advisory Board was looking at. Delegate Yancey is another one, just to throw out another name, in terms of there were a lot of delegates sponsoring these types of bills. They unfortunately just either died in like a subcommittee or a committee somewhere for the most part. But I do think that in terms of what should be done, like a public comment period, I think would be good. I don't think it solves the whole problem, but it prevents them from kind of throwing it on students in the middle of midterms, like, hey, you're paying 10% more for tuition. In terms of like keeping the rate for all 4 years, that's something that JMU does as well. So students actually kind of know what they're going to be paying when they go in. And again, like I think these are all good ideas. I'd take any of them if they were to pass. Yeah. But that's definitely something I think we can work on in the future.
So one bill that's been talked about a lot this term, and it's been talked a lot on grounds and has been a source for student activism, has been giving Dreamers in-state tuition. That was not really gain much traction in the General Assembly. But do you believe the bill should have passed, or do you think it was pretty correctly defeated?
So my personal opinion on this, again, not representative of the entire, like, people in my organization. I think that, it's very difficult to, while I am very sympathetic to Dreamers on Grounds, I think there should be some sort of pathway to citizenship for them, or pathway to legal status, whatever you want to call it. I think that needs to be dealt with first. And I know that on a federal level, there's definitely been a lot of gridlock on both sides in terms of, like, coming to some sort of compromise on immigration, despite the fact that both sides have kind of almost, like, conceded parts that the other side wants, which is very frustrating. But I think that it's very difficult for me to say that we're going to give in-state tuition to people who came here illegally, although it wasn't their choice, it was their parents' choice, and they shouldn't be punished for that. When there are people who have come here legally, immigrated legally to the United States, who were paying out-of-state tuition, and are not getting those same type of benefits. So for me, that's kind of where I would be worried about it, is the fact that we're disincentivizing people to come here legally, and who might be coming from out of state. Although I do think that the people who are Dreamers and did have that situation, I think that federal government should resolve that. I think there should be a pathway to citizenship. They should be legalized in some way or another, and if that comes with border security, that would also be great. And from my perspective, or some sort of deal like that. But I think that right now we can't be giving benefits out to people who did come here illegally, even though it wasn't their choice, when people who come here legally would be essentially getting punished for it. But I do, I am very sympathetic to the situation. I do think there should be some sort of resolution to it, and the fact that the federal government hasn't dealt with that is disappointing me.
Yeah, I think given that the federal government has dealt with it is very disappointing, but I think this was one way that on the state level we could have dealt with it, and it was really disappointing to me to see that this bill ultimately failed. It was something that a lot of our members joined Dreamers on Grounds and calling on behalf of, so I would have really liked to see this bill passed, but hopefully in the future, there's always next year. So I'm optimistic, but I think it's definitely, we have to continue the fight for it.
Moving on, there's been a lot of talk about marijuana reform in the past few years, with a lot of states legalizing it for recreational use, and mostly because mass incarceration has become such a huge problem in the United States. There have been some minor, like, legislative moves. Like, there have been some moves to decriminalize marijuana possession, but that was kind of thought to be not feasible. And some people thought of the idea to maybe get some marijuana charges expunged. Do you think we should be trying to reform the criminal justice system in terms of this drug in the Commonwealth? Or do you think because there's been so little action on the issue that it's not really feasible?
Yeah, I think it is definitely an important step in reforming the criminal justice system. I think there's a lot of space for reform. I mean, I would like to see more movement on the issue towards legalization, or a small step I think would be decriminalization, because I think there are a lot of people that are put in jail for this and taking resources from the state to state funding penitentiaries. People are in there, and I think that money could be used somewhere else that would be more beneficial. So I think this is a small step in kind of changing up the allocation of resources. Yeah, it's something I'd like to see more of, but
yeah, no, I definitely agree on this issue for sure. I think that one thing that Mary Alice mentioned earlier was raising the felony larceny rate. I think that was a very good move. I would have, again, like to see it raised even higher. $500 seems kind of low for that type of thing. But I also think that like decriminalizing or trying to expunge certain charges would be a good thing on the state level. On the federal level, Congressman Tom Garrett is actually a co-sponsor of a bill that do it federally. I don't know if that's really viable on the federal level. But on the statewide level, I think it is definitely a good criminal justice reform action that we can take.
I just have one more question for you guys. What initiatives do you want the General Assembly to tackle in the next session, and what impact do you think student groups such as yours can make on the legislative process and just getting the voice of students, whether it be liberal or conservative, out there?
Yeah, so I think that I definitely kind of like as we were talking about earlier, education reform. Some of the bills that we talked about earlier would be really great. I would like to see more progress made on regulatory reform and things like that. I think that one of the best things the General Assembly did last session was they actually increase transparency a lot, and the fact that all votes are now recorded, they're all recorded on video, you can actually see what's happening. So I'm very, very excited about that, and I hope that that continues in the future as well as things like and especially if they do go down the Medicaid expansion route, looking at things like cutting spending, tax reform, ways to make our government more efficient, I think would be good as well. Because if they do adopt Medicaid expansion, which again I think I would disagree with, like they're going to need to definitely start reforming some of these other programs to figure out how to pay for it. But in general, even if they don't do it, they should still be looking into that.
Yeah, I think the transparency, I was reading up on that, is really interesting, and I think it's a step in the right direction, holding our representatives accountable. I think something else that I'm really excited about is the amount of women and different minorities that are represented now in the House delegates and the state Senate. I think that will hopefully in the future allow more legislation to come forth that's representative and advocates on behalf of all members of the Commonwealth, all residents, because I think in the past it's something that was often overlooked, and I think the amount of female representation is really, really important. I'm hoping that maybe the ERA will be brought back, that hopefully we'll be able to pass Medicaid expansion, and some of these efforts, and that we can have bipartisan support on some of them, I think would be really important. Like the transparency, there was some bipartisan support on Medicaid expansion. If we have some more bipartisanship, I think would also be key. Also, as Adam said, with higher education reform and tuition rates, I think that's really important that students can be advocating on behalf of. I'd love to see more students going down to the General Assembly to lobby. I think Student Council does a great job with that, with the Legislative Affairs Committee and the Legislative Advisory Board that we're part of. I think there's some great work, and I think students, we are residents here. We encourage our students to register to vote in Virginia and to register to vote in Charlottesville. And so by doing that, I think the next step is making sure they're informed and active in the electoral and the legislative process.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. That's all I've got.